Okay, as we continue to think about the 5 stages of listening, we also have to think about what it means to be an effective listener. Sometimes the best way to understand effectiveness is also to understand what you're doing that's ineffective. So, ineffective listening really includes several stages or types of listening. The first is pseudo listening. This is where I'm giving you all the visual cues that you need to assume that I'm paying attention. Again, this is your classmate who completely fails a test, yet the professor all along was like, that person's absolutely with me. They're nodding their head, they're leaning forward, they're making, yep, all those noises. It implies absolutely they're paying attention, but it's pseudo listening. They're not, their mind is completely somewhere else, daydreaming, if you will. The second thing is stage hogging. This is where the listener cannot allow the speaker to actually complete a series of thoughts. In fact, the listener is so anxious to tell his or her own story that they begin to hog the stage and take over. They want to share their own information, so it doesn't really matter what the speaker has to say. The third thing to think about is selective listening. This is where you respond only to remarks that impact you directly or have some interest area to you. Sometimes this is legitimate. We tend to screen out things like commercials or other background noise. I often use the example of the radar detector in my car. I often do not think about that beeping noise that it makes until there's a passenger in my car who does not have one. They're automatically like, what's that noise? What's going on? What's going on? I don't even hear it. It obviously registers for me in some way. Apparently, when it goes off, I slow down. But in that same sense, the other person is hyper alert to that. It's a very different sound. They're listening to something that I, over time, have just simply tuned out. There's also defensive listening. This is when the listener takes the other person's remarks to be personal affronts or personal attacks. In this sense, you often think of teens and their parents. In my case, my 7-year-old. So if I were to ask her while she's at her art desk, what are you doing? She would automatically assume that I am asking for some other reason. For instance, this morning I said, what are you doing? I already fixed my hair. I'm ready for school. And I was like, I'm sorry. Okay, we're screaming. There was an automatic defensive response. So she wasn't really listening. I was really asking what she was working on. So thinking about that defensive listening, you want to ensure that you're actually listening to what's being asked, not to the assumptions that you've made or preconceptions that you might have prior to that conversation. You also want to think about ambushing. This tends to happen in conflict, which we'll be talking about next week. But in ambushing, the listener is really only listening for key words or phrases in which he or she can jump on that to then attack the speaker. So again, thinking about that in terms of conflict or argument. And then ultimately, insensitive listening. This is where the listener is responding to sort of superficial content that's not really essential to what the speaker is saying, and instead ignoring things like the emotion of the conversation. They're not addressing what the speaker is really asking for, which may be empathy, sympathy, or some other level of support. Instead, they respond to those sort of superficial layers of the conversation and leave emotion out of it. Beyond this, we need to think about why we might be ineffective listeners. At times, we're ineffective because we're just going through message overload. I've often told my family when I first walk in the door is not at all the best time to have a conversation with me. There are so many things happening. I'm thinking ahead to dinner. I'm thinking ahead to the activities that we have going on. I'm still processing what happened in my workday, right? So that downtime, which some people achieve in travel time to and from work or school, others might need in their first few minutes at home. So that could be one reason for ineffective listening. Again, it could also be related to some of our own issues. It could have direct relation to our hearing ability. It could have direct relation to simply our emotional state at that time. Now that we know that ineffective listening happens, however, how can we work to become better listeners? One idea is to talk less. Good listeners tend to know when to stop talking. Avoid preoccupation. Make sure that you're in a totally focused state when you're listening to someone talk, if possible, or at least avoid those things that are happening around you. You also want to think of not judging prematurely. So let's talk a little bit about judging. The process of judging is responding to a speaker in a way that evaluates their thoughts or behaviors either favorably or unfavorably. Excuse me. That tends to be best received if the person who's presenting a problem to you is actually seeking your solution. Um, and also, if the intent of your judgment um, is to be genuinely constructive and not just meant as a put down. So, this can be a very tricky aspect to include in your listening and in turn your responding to the speaker. Are they actually asking for a judgment on your part? If not, then part of becoming a better, more effective listener is to eliminate that judging. They may not be asking for a solution to their problem. They may simply be wanting to talk out the fact that they have a problem. Maybe they already have in their minds a solution to that, and or they simply don't care what your opinion is. They just want someone to listen to them. In part, they may be using the listener as a way to sort of think through all of their own ideas. Judging, though, tends to set us up for our conversations in week 10. These conversations will deal with conflict management. So, as you can imagine, and have probably already experienced, judging is not always well received. When judging isn't well received, it tends to lead to some level of conflict or argument. So, next week, we'll take a more extensive look at that.